The nature of human evil is an ongoing mystery, pondered by philosophers and psychologists alike. What is evil? Why does it exist? And even more puzzlingly, why does evil sometimes occur on a mass scale? Evil refers to something that is profoundly immoral and wicked, a personal act that is the direct opposite of good. Morality is subjective. What is considered right or wrong depends on time, place, and individual values. Socrates stated, "There is but one evil, ignorance, and there is one good, knowledge." One must be educated in right and wrong to understand it, which is why countries now have laws that explicitly state what is right and wrong, and societal norms taught from birth that relay the same message. Laws and attitudes adapt and change, meaning acts that may have been normalized in years past are now seen as atrocities and examples of evil. In World War II, what constituted evil was given a whole new context. Not only were losses greater, 75 million compared to 20 million in World War I, but the revelation of widespread depravity reached the public. 1941 to 1945, Germany was engulfed in a structured, mechanical regime. This regime aimed to rebuild the world using unthinkable methods. While Culture World mandated bigotry, unethical experiments, forced labour, and calculated elimination of entire groups were not new concepts, they'd never been conducted on such a massive scale. During this period, 50% of the world's Jewish population was wiped out. In comparison, this was about 60% of the Jewish population of Europe. Groups such as the disabled, other racial/ethnic minorities, and political dissenters were also targeted. The vast majority of these people were civilians, taken from their homes and transported to camps. An estimated 11 million would be lost during this time. A few years earlier, in December 1937, another case of brutality took place in Nanjing, the former capital of China, then known as Nanking. Japanese forces marched on the city and wreaked havoc. Approximately 15,000 male prisoners and 50,000 male civilians' lives were ended. At least 20,000 women and girls of all ages were essayed. Abu Ghraib, Iraq. US forces took over the prison and arrested civilians, reportedly to gain intel regarding Al-Qaeda. In 2004, it was exposed that the inmates were subjected to harsh and inhumane treatment, acts that were all photographed and videoed by US personnel. All three cases are considered to be examples of evil, and there are numerous throughout history, from small-scale atrocities to widespread colonization. The perpetrators in most of these cases also happen to have been normal, unassuming human beings who otherwise would not stand out in public whatsoever. Taking away the theistic view of devils, spirits, and supernatural forces that influence human beings, because it cannot be proven, the answers psychologically are obedience, power, and dehumanization. 1961, Yale University. Psychologist Stanley Milgram asked the very same question inspired by the first case, the atrocities of World War II. He began an obedience study. Were these people simply following orders in World War II, as many claim? Male participants were recruited through ads in newspapers, and many of them were students, average, everyday human beings that you would walk past in the street. They were told that they would participate in a learning experiment. There was one learner and one teacher, but this was fixed, so that the participant would always be the teacher, whereas the learner would be played by an actor who was in on the experiment. The teacher has to name a word, and the learner chooses from a list of 4. If the learner picked the wrong word, the teacher would administer an electric shock for each wrong answer. The electric shocks would start from 15 volts to a lethal 450 volts, and the teacher would have to increase the voltage with each wrong answer. Of course, the learner was a plant and an actor and would pretend to be shocked. If the teacher decided that they didn't want to continue with the experiment, there were 4 prompts given by a present researcher. The first would be, "Please continue." The second, "The experiment requires you to continue." The third, "It is absolutely essential that you continue." And finally, "You have no other choice but to continue." The results demonstrated that 65% of the participants would continue to the highest voltage of 450, and 100% of them went to 300 volts. 18 variations of Milgram's experiment took place, and different conclusions came based on this. It was concluded that an authority figure, the experimenter in a lab coat, was key to obedience, as a present authority figure meant that the participant was more likely to follow orders. If the experimenter was just wearing normal everyday clothes, obedience dropped 20%. It was also found that the location of the experiment was important. When held in an office building rather than a university, obedience dropped to 47.5. Shared responsibility was also something that came into play. When there was more than one teacher, obedience went up to 92.5%. Yes, 92.5% of participants shocked people to the lethal 450 volts if they had somebody else sharing the blame with them. Touch proximity was also an important factor. If the teachers were told they had to force the learner's hand onto a shock plate after 150 volts, obedience dropped to 30%. Social support was interesting. When there was a planted teacher beside another teacher who was refusing to do the shocking, obedience dropped to 10%. Having an absentee experimenter or authority figure also reduced obedience. When the experimenter wasn't in the room with the teacher, obedience dropped to 20.5%. The Milgram experiment was focused on authority figures and power, and played with variables such as who was making the orders, whether or not the teacher could see the learner, and also how many teachers providing social support. But what about aspects of dehumanization? Zimbardo 1973 wanted to investigate prisoner maltreatment. 74 applicants were screened for psychological issues, medical disabilities, history of crime, and substance misuse. Only 24 of these would meet the criteria. They were all randomly assigned a role of prisoner or guard. There were 2 reserves and 1 dropped out, leaving 10 prisoners and 11 guards. Prisoner participants were treated as criminals, arrested randomly at their own homes, and taken to Stanford University's basement that had been turned into a makeshift prison. And then the process of de-individuation and dehumanization began. They were all stripped naked, deloused, personal possessions of theirs were removed, and they were locked in a cell and given uniforms to wear. They were all given a number that they would be referred to rather than their own names. The guards, however, were also given their own uniforms, a whistle and a club. All of them wore sunglasses to hide most of their expressions. 3 guards would work 8-hour shifts, and the others remained on call. The guards were told by researchers that they could do whatever they deemed necessary to maintain order and command respect, with no physical violence. The findings were shocking. The first is asserting authority. Within hours, the guards began harassing prisoners, and at 2:30 a.m., the prisoners were awoken with whistles during a count. Counts were regularly utilized to exert control over prisoners. The prisoners' behavior changed a lot also. They would constantly talk about prison issues and would snitch on each other. Despite the lack of physical violence, they were still given a lot of punishments. They were often insulted, given pointless menial tasks, and were forced to do push-ups, sometimes with guards stepping on their bodies, or they made other prisoners sit on their backs while they did it. Asserting independence. On just day 2, prisoners removed their stocking caps, ripped their numbers off their uniforms, and barricaded themselves in cells. Reinforcements were called in by the guards, and the ringleaders placed into solitary confinement. Special privileges. Those least involved within this rebellion got special food that they had to eat in front of the others to break solidarity. Further changes were noticed in the attitude and behaviours of both prisoners and guards. The prisoners became more submissive, whereas the guards became much more aggressive. And then there was, in particular, prisoner number 8612. Less than 36 hours in, he began suffering from acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying and rage. The guards offered him an informant status. However, he refused, and they responded taunting him, "You can't leave, you can't quit." number 8612 started to, quote-unquote, act crazy, screaming, swearing, and displaying fits of uncontrollable rage. He was let out by the researchers shortly after. The following day, the prisoners were permitted to have their families visit for 1 hour, and after the visits, a rumour spread of an escape plan. Remember that this is an experiment and any participant could leave when they wanted to. They were treating this as if it were a real prison. This rumoured escape plan reached the ears of the guards, who began harassing them even harder. And next is the case of prisoner number 819. A Catholic priest came to evaluate how realistic the prison was, as he was a former prison chaplain. Prisoner number 819 broke down while talking to the priest. After this, the guards made the other prisoners chant, "Prisoner number 189 is a bad prisoner." This worsened the prisoner's state to the point Zimbardo himself had to come in and remind him of his name and that this was all an experiment and he wasn't actually a prisoner. The experiment was supposed to run for a total of 14 days, but only managed to get to day 6 due to emotional stress of prisoners and the excessive aggression of guards. This was an unprecedented set of results because both guards and prisoners had all been screened for psychological issues, a history of crime, substance misuse. All of these things were checked prior to the experiment taking place. None of the prisoners experienced issues emotionally or psychologically before going into this experiment, and none of the guards had any personality disorders or any problems with anger. Both of these experiments make me ponder the nature of evil. Both of these experiments focus on power and what power does. There are 2 common sayings about power. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and another that contrasts this: power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. When looking at these experiments and mass atrocities that inspired these experiments, the latter saying gives a depressing and pessimistic view of humanity. Its message conveys that not only are human beings capable of committing these things, that we actually want to, and the power is what reveals those innermost dark desires. Are human beings simply depraved and sadistic, and as soon as they get a sliver of power to get away with it, they do so because it reveals them? Or is it the power that corrupts and causes them to do this? Looking at these experiments, I think the clear-cut answer is actually a third. A governing power that is revealing itself through its power will force people beneath them to do their bidding, and therefore reveals the governing body rather than those committing the atrocities. When you have a corrupt authoritarian figure commanding you to do things, such as a man in a lab coat, or a researcher validating you by saying you can do whatever you want, that is what causes evil to happen. In the words of Anne Frank, "In spite of everything, I still believe people are really good at heart."